I recently posted a video about focus bracketing on the Sony A7 IV, and I got a lot of questions from you all about how I post-process my focus stacked images and what software I use for that. And actually, the images that I got at that location are a very good example of times when automatic focus stacking software doesn't get it quite right, and a photographer has to step in and take some manual steps to get the image that they wanted. Now, I have used focus stacking on literally thousands of raw files at this point, and it's become a pretty critical part of my workflow for any wide-angle images. So I thought I would take a minute and just show exactly what I'm doing to stack those images together, and then compare those results to some of the suggestions that you made, specifically Helicon Focus and also Affinity Photo. Okay, I guess we can start by really just looking at the images I took on location. So here are the 9 images that focus bracketing took for me. I'll say that if I was doing this manually, I might do 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 images in total for a shot like this. If you pixel peep and look at these images individually, you can see very clearly that, like, this one, the first photo that I took, I was clearly focusing on this leaf. And then let's go sort of midway into this. You can see that the leaf has only a little bit in focus, not a lot in focus over here, but that the midground is a little more in focus. And finally, if I pop over to the last image, you can see that the background is very sharp in focus there. And then, if I go down to this foreground, this leaf is no longer in focus kind of at all. So typically my process after I've sort of identified all these images will really just be to open them. I go edit in, open as layers in Photoshop. And what that's going to do is it's just going to move all of these raw files over to Photoshop, and it's going to give them to me all as layers, just like it said it was going to do. Now, usually the first thing I do, and I've already done this, is order these so that the bottom image in this stack, the one that's behind everything else, below everything else, was actually the first foreground shot that I took, and I order them all the way to the background. And there's no real reason for this. It's just that in my workflow, I like to be able to sort of build on top of each layer until I finally get to the background. And that's the process that I sort of take. But however Photoshop automatically does this, if it works for you, it works great. So typically once you've loaded these all into Photoshop, what you'll do is you'll select them all, and then you'll go up to Edit and go to Auto Align Layers. Now, there's a couple reasons why this is important. The first is when you're on location and you're touching your camera, even just to hit the shutter button, your camera is going to move ever so slightly for each shot, and it's going to misalign each image. But more importantly, and the thing I think people don't really talk about, is focus breathing. Now let me show you what I'm talking about back in Lightroom. So if I go through these images individually, what you can see is that each image, as the focus point moves back, I'm actually zooming out a little bit. And this isn't a zoom lens that I took this on. This is a 14mm prime lens. So what's actually happening here is that the focusing element, the pieces of glass inside the lens that are moving back and forth to move the focus point, are also changing the overall focal length of this lens. You can see the sort of extreme between the last one and the first one. It really zooms in quite a lot. So when you are in Photoshop, and you're going to align those layers, not only is it going to sort of move them around just a little bit so that all the elements in the frame line up, but it's also going to make some of them a little bit larger or a little bit smaller and lay them over each other so that everything still lines up, even with that kind of zooming effect of the focus breathing. Okay, I now have my aligned images, and you can see actually if you go through them that there's a little bit of sort of clear area on the side of each. So that just means that they have been lined up and zoomed and tilted and all these different things so that they are all pretty much exactly the same to where I shot them. The next step with all of these layers still aligned is you go back up to Edit, and underneath your Auto Aligned layer, you go Auto Blend Layers. Now there's 2 options for this, but what you want to do a focus stack is a stacked images. I usually leave these seamless tones and colors and content aware fill transparent areas unchecked because I want to see like whatever problems were created and then see if I can fix them manually. I'm going to leave them undone this time. Okay, so Photoshop has now blended these photos together, but I can immediately see a problem. Let's go through and just talk about what it's done well, what it has not done well. So if I look at this top image, right? This is all of the layers that have been blended together. Photoshop has used a mask on each of these images to select the parts that it thinks are the best in focus and, exclude the pieces that are not in focus. And it's put all of those together into one image. As you can see, the background of this image is nicely in focus, and the foreground of this image is nicely in focus, and the midground of this image is nicely in focus. And so this would be a properly focus stacked image. But I had some movement in this water that was very close that I know was going to cause some problems because I've used this tool so many times. Let's kind of zoom in and take a look at this leaf and see sort of like maybe some of the challenges that are there. So right off the bat, you can see areas that are simply like pixelated because the mask has kind of like screwed up exactly where, what image to select. So these are not so smooth over here. This area down here has a couple of like artifacty looking problems. Down here definitely looks really rough. And then also the middle of the leaf here seems to have, I don't know what this is, but some kind of like weird blue, I don't know, something that's coming through, probably some water and the light just caught it in the right way. And there's like a couple of parts of the leaf that are really in focus, and there's this part over here that I guess is covered in water, but it like doesn't look particularly well. It's not really a great job overall. Well, because Photoshop has done all of these things just as masks, I can actually kind of look through and figure out which image had, these different problems in them, and then I can decide exactly what parts of what image that I want to keep. In this bottom image, probably this is where the problems began. Because I know that I'm focusing on this area here, and I know that the rest of this should be in focus. So what do? Well, I got to go grab my brush tool, and I want to be painting, painting this mask in. So I'm just going to go and, whoops. Okay, I'm just going to go and take the white part of this brush and just paint over these pieces of clear so that what I'm actually doing is selecting the image, parts of the image for this first foreground image. And I'll also go down to this area because probably no image had that in focus, but the first image was going to be the most in focus, so that probably does the best job. So I'm going to continue doing this for all of these images. And really what I'm trying to do is just like correct for this problem that Photoshop created for me so that now I can end up with like the right things in focus down here and it all sort of looks the way that I want it to. Okay, I've come finally to this pretty ridiculous image here. And actually you can see that it's very pixelatedly pulled in this weird blue, I don't know what this is. So I'm actually going to just like delete this mask and then get a good idea of exactly what part that is, what that should look like. And I'll put these back. Okay, so I guess what's happened here is there's been a bit of reflection and the water has moved in such a way that it's really brought quite a lot of color. And this is kind of where this problem begins, is that this sort of looks a bit in focus. Now it's clearly just like a bit of water that's streaked across the scene, but you can tell that like the automatic focus stacking has detected this as being like a good part of this image compared to the rest of them that are pretty blurry, and it's decided to bring that forward. So what I'm gonna do is just sort of get rid of that part of the image because basically, it doesn't do it for me. It doesn't do anything. But luckily I can paint that through. Looks like I've got some challenges with this image too. Okay, I'm not going to bore you with the rest of that process, but you can tell that it's a lot of manual work going through each of these images, finding the parts of the image that you like and removing the parts of the images that you don't like in order to end up with one final image. And it's quite tedious. When I did this initially a couple of weeks ago, this was quite a lot of work. And I kind of wish that I had done my original focus stacking process of doing these manually rather than letting the camera kind of figure that out. But let's try this out in a couple of other pieces of software and see if they do a better job with it, or if I'm more easily able to make the manual edits that I want to. Okay, this was the first suggestion. It's a piece of software I hadn't tried before. This is Helicon Focus. Helicon Focus, Helicon Focus. And all you've got to do with this is go in and select the images that you want. There's a couple of options that you can take in here, but otherwise you just hit render and it gives you this nice little visual process you'll get to see of all of the different parts of each image that it's selecting as it slowly sort of blends them together. It's quite nice. Okay, well that one took a little longer and definitely my computer revved up like a jet engine, but let's take a look at the results. You can see the very first thing that I went to was this weird sort of blue artifact, and it's done exactly the same thing with that Photoshop did, which is to identify it as a part of the sort of image that's in focus or the most in focus, and then blended that in. Now, it's done a much better job blending these photos together because there's no like artifacting or weird sort of problems that there were in Photoshop, but it still has this one problem. So let me just go ahead and take a look at the rest of the image and see sort of anything else. Maybe I think there's a problem or not. No, it looks okay, and definitely just a real simple cursory overview of sort of what's happening, and it's done a much better job. But I still have this little problem, and now what I got to do is figure out exactly how to remove that. Okay, I think what I'm going to do, maybe the easiest thing to do, is I'm just going to go over to this retouching tab, and it's got the first image here in this stack selected, and I'm just going to kind of paint over this part of this image over here to maybe just remove that, that weird artifact. And now I would say this image is pretty good. So thank you for that suggestion, all the people who said that Helicon Focus would do a better job with this. It definitely has, and I think I'm going to figure out if I can work this into my workflow a little bit more, and maybe after the free trial is done, kind of see if I want to pay for it. Okay, the next one that I want to try out is Affinity Photo 2. Now, I used to be an Affinity Photo user, and the main reason that I wanted to do that was because it has inbuilt focus stacking. Let's try it out. If I go up into File, there's an option here for New Focus Merge, and all I've got to do is go in and add the photos that I want, just kind of like with Helicon Focus, and hit OK. And in this one, I also get a nice little kind of animation and visual of what's actually happening. Proof in the pudding, so let's go take a look at our sample here. And you know what? I'd say this has done like a bit of a better job than either Photoshop or Helicon Focus. There's definitely no artifacting that I can see around here that like looks really awkward like there was in Photoshop. There still is this problem here, but I kind of got to give them a pass on that one because I built software in the past. I understand how they're doing this work of trying to identify which parts have like the most amount of contrast and therefore they're in focus. And this has to work both for landscape photographers and for macro photographers. And in the macro photography use case, this is probably much more common that there's many parts of the image that are in focus rather than on the landscape photography one where it's really just like foreground, bits of midground, and then finally the background is in focus. So I'm going to give the developers a bit of a pass on this one. All I really have to do, again, is just find the image that I like and then paint in just that one little piece. So I guess the question is like, is this going to affect my workflow? And I think the answer is probably yes. I have been looking for a replacement for my Adobe stack for some time, and I think actually I may have found one in Affinity Photo, or maybe using Helicon Focus as a plugin for like Capture One or something like that. I guess more to come on what I end up choosing. Either way, hopefully you learned something about how I'm doing my focus stacking, how you can do that, and some of the different comparisons that you can make between the software that allow you to do it automatically. Thanks very much for watching. Bye for now.